Welcome to this message on chapters 14 through 17 of the Gospel of Matthew. At this point in the Gospel, when we start into chapter 14, we find that the tone of the narrative changes. You could say the mood of the reader changes as they respond to that tone. Certainly the mood of Jesus seems to change. And the event that provoked this is the death of John the Baptist. John had been imprisoned by Herod Antipas, and now at this point, at the instigation of Herodias, the wife that he took from his brother Philip, John was beheaded, and the disciples came and told Jesus. And at that point, Jesus wanted to be alone. We could assume that he wanted to process this. He just lost his cousin on a human level. But also John was his forerunner in ministry. And he knew that he would be next. His impending crucifixion came into focus. And so he had the weight of that within himself, within his soul. And so he decided to go away and to be alone for a time. Now, when he went away on the boat to the other side of the lake, what happened was that the people saw that he was going and ran there to get there ahead of him because they wanted to continue with what they had become accustomed to. His blessings and his healings. And so when he got off the boat, there they were. So what was he to do? Was he going to say, sorry folks, this is my Sabbath time, this is my alone time, not today? He didn't do that. He found a way to navigate the tension of his legitimate need to be alone, and also the fact that the people around him weren't in the same space internally where he was, but they continued to look to him to meet their needs. So he healed them, and as the evening wore on, his disciples said to Jesus, send them away now. And that, of course, would have been a tempting prospect. But Jesus didn't want to be irresponsible toward them, and so he decided to feed them before sending them away. And so at that point we have the feeding of the 5,000. And an outward reading of this passage would say, whoa, that's the big story here. But there's actually a bigger story going on internally in Jesus at this time. And that's often the case in your life too. People look at the outward part of your life and say, oh, this and that is going on. And yes, it is. But for you, there's a far deeper narrative been written in the hidden place. And so Jesus fed them, then he dismissed the crowd, sent the disciples away, and went up in the mountain where he spent a lot of time alone. So he did, in the end, get his alone time. But he had to exercise patience and endure some tension between the outward demands and his inward needs in order to get that alone time. And you may find that in your own life too, that the need for alone time is real to process, and yet you may have people in your life who look to you to meet their needs. And they perhaps don't see anything beyond the outward relationship where you meet their needs, although you may have some very private griefs that you're processing at the same time. And of course, Jesus gives an example of how to conduct ourselves as a person in that sort of situation. And so he sent them away, and then during the night, because the rowing was difficult, Jesus came to them walking in the water. And Peter, who was always the external processor, and God bless Peter, and thanks be to God for people like Peter, people who will say a thing or try a thing that other people are probably thinking, and when they say it or try it, other people say, oh, that wasn't the best thing to do, that wasn't the best thing to say. But nobody would be any the wiser were it not for Peter or people like him who actually put it on the table and let it happen and see what will transpire. So Peter, of course, came to walk toward Jesus, and then it was successful up to a point, and then they came back into the boat, and there was a great calm, and they worshipped him. And so we go on from there into chapter 15, and it's like old times. Jesus engaging with the Pharisees again. They're criticizing him, they're asking him questions, and then there's the crumbs lady. So there's this woman, this Syrophoenician woman, who comes to Jesus and says, Master, come and heal my daughter. Or actually she calls him Son of David, which is quite a title. It's only used by Bartimaeus in the other Gospels. But in Matthew's Gospel, it's used quite a few times. Of course, Son of David carries all the connotation of the restoration of the days of glory, the glorious kingdom. And, of course, as the Son of David, the new righteous kingdom that would last forever. She wasn't even a Jew, and she was appealing to the Son of David, which is quite something. And so she came to him, and Jesus said to her, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, there are many ways we can read this. One is that Jesus accepted the limits of his ministry. Jesus didn't do everything that maybe he could have done. He did what was in the will of the Father for him. You might say, if you were managing Jesus' ministry, you might put him on a much larger platform much sooner, an international ministry. But he accepted the constraints of the ministry that was given to him. And of course, that's the path of obedience and the path of eventual blessing as well. But he said this to the woman, and it seems he was provoking her to be more violent in her faith. He talked earlier about, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence. Well, he wanted this woman to seize and take what she could have in her relationship with him. And so faith is not for the faint-hearted. Faith is determination, just as love is determination. And so she was determined that she would have what she needed. And she said, but when she pursued him, he said, you can't take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And she said, but even the dogs take the crumbs that fall from the children's table. So she, rather than being offended by his apparent reluctance, she allowed it to provoke her into a greater level of faith. And then he said, great is your faith. And she was a Gentile woman, which is something. And so again, she exemplified the kind of faith that Jesus commended, even though at first it seemed that he was discouraging her. But that was in order to draw out of her that determination and faith that would lay hold of what he had for her. And so this narrative goes on from there to the feeding of the 4,000. So the disciples were slow learners. I mean, Jesus had fed 5,000, and yet with the 4,000 they thought, oh, there's no way we can cope with this. So even after Jesus saying or doing something, they still often didn't get it. And I know I can be like that. We can be slow to learn. We have habitual thoughts, habits and patterns, not just in our muscles and our behaviour, but in our minds as well. We see things a certain way. And even after hearing some words of Jesus and seeing things he's done, we still maybe don't comprehend quickly or easily that he's able to do things like that. So we move on then into chapter 16, and continuing on the bread theme, after speaking with the Pharisees and offering them only the sign of Jonah, which was a cryptic reference, when they don't have bread in the boat, the disciples say, "Oh, we didn't bring bread," and Jesus says, "It's not the bread of the 5,000, the 4,000. Don't you remember? Don't worry about that bread. It's just the bread of the Pharisees. Beware of the teaching of the Pharisees." And so when they came to Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asked this significant question. He says, "Who do people say that I am?" And that's quite a thing in a relationship, isn't it? When you level with someone like that and say, "Who am I and who am I to you?" And so he asked this question and said, "Oh, this is what other people say," which of course is easier to talk about. They say you're Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets or John the Baptist. And Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter again is the one to speak up and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Peter, because this has been revealed to you by my Father." So this was a big discovery, a big dawning that Peter expressed. You are the Christ. And with the revelation of Christ and who he is, which is so central to our spiritual wellness, with that revelation comes additional revelation. And Peter, in addition to seeing who Christ was, Jesus immediately said, "And you are Peter." So there's a self-revelation. Just as the Old Testament scripture says, "In thy light we see light." That when we have a vision of God and a vision of Jesus, in that we see things and see ourselves as they are. So with the revelation of who Jesus was came the revelation to Peter of who Peter was and of the purpose of God. It says, "Upon this rock I will build my church." So it's we could say it's impossible to see who Jesus is without also seeing his church, those who are members of his body. So all of this comes with the revelation of who Jesus is. And then there also comes an additional revelation when we see who Jesus is. And this is a revelation that's not welcome. And Jesus offered this revelation now. He said, the Son of Man will be crucified. He will die. And Peter couldn't take that. He said, no, this won't happen to you. And Peter, who had got it so right just a few minutes before, my Father has revealed this to you, now gets it so wrong, so that Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. We can be so right about some things and so wrong about other things. We can be so right about something and very quickly after be so wrong about something else. So we must always just have that dependence and humility and looking to the Word of God to instruct us, knowing that we are liable to go astray, and past form is not a guarantee that we won't put our foot wrong the next time we lift it up. So Peter rebukes Jesus for this, and did the disciples get at this point? It seems that maybe they didn't. It didn't quite have an impact on them. They just protested against protested against the revelation rather than being receptive to that revelation that Jesus gave them. So he told them that the Son of Man would have to suffer, and that just didn't seem to fit. And then when we go on into chapter 17, we have the transfiguration. So here we have the juxtaposition of these opposites, the suffering servant and the King of glory. And yet in his person, Jesus combines these two. So there he is glorified on the mountain and seen by Peter and James and John. And then when they come down the mountain, there's the attempted deliverance going on. But then again, Jesus speaks to them. And it says from that time on, he began to tell them that he would suffer and die. And it says they were deeply grieved. It seems that at this point, as Jesus repeated this message about his death, that the disciples also entered into this mood of realization, this grief. They were deeply grieved. That grief is to be really affected. It's a deep word, but then it's accentuated again with this deeply. It was extreme. And so we find in the disciples that they realize that being with Jesus is not just a question of healings and good news and miracles, but that there's a price for all of that. And the price is great. And Jesus will soon have to pay that price. So this, previously where Jesus had this realization within himself that he was facing his death, and the crowds and the disciples didn't seem to share that, now the disciples are beginning to enter into recognizing that he is also the man of sorrows, and they are also entering into that sorrow and being very much affected by it. And as I said, when we read these chapters outwardly, we think, highlights, the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, the transfiguration and so on. But if we could read whatever journal the disciples might have written that evening, if they kept journals, and I guess they didn't, but if they were to keep a journal, what their hearts were heavy with was that Jesus had told them that he's going to die, and that overshadows all these outward things. And still, life goes on. They went back to Capernaum, and the temple tax people came and says, does your master pay the temple tax? So even though we may have very deep grief and sorrows in our internal life, outward life carries on. And that can be difficult to go through, because now our hearts are heavy as we walk through these normal things that we've done previously with maybe a lighter heart. So here's Peter with this great weight of what Jesus has said on him. And he's asked about paying the temple tax, and says, yes, we'll pay the temple tax. And when he goes back into the house, Jesus speaks to him and says these beautiful words. He says, go and get the coin, from the fish, and give that to them for me and for you. Like, what beautiful words, and what a way for people to speak to each other when they're experiencing grief and sadness. Or for you and I to speak to our friends who are experiencing grief and sadness. That even though the sadness is there and cannot be removed or fixed, and even though the ordinary things of life still need to be attended to, there is a togetherness. There is a comfort from togetherness. I mean, I would love Jesus to say that to me, wouldn't you? Let's pay our VAT. Let's pay our taxes. Here's enough for me and you. That sense of partnership and fellowship, that we are close, we are together, we are in friendship, we're in relationship. And so in Peter's sadness and bewilderment, there is the comfort of togetherness. So when you and I are dealing with someone in grief, that's what we offer. We offer, I am here with you in this moment. I cannot fix your pains, I cannot fix your grief, but you are not alone. We are together, our bond remains, and that becomes a comfort to the person grieving. So we're in this section now of the Gospel where the reality of Jesus' death is coming into focus. And we'll be moving on then in our next study into the next chapter, which contains the block of teaching from this section.